The iron-rimmed leather satchel rested against the frost-covered stones of the chamber floor. Evangeline Sterling did not look at the heavy iron door sealing her inside the high tower of Silt-Hold Fortress. She looked only at the small, square glass pot of iron gall ink resting beside her swollen belly. The dark liquid inside was beginning to crystallize at the edges. If the ink froze completely, her specialized cartography tools would become entirely useless. That was the kind of invisible she had become under Earl Roderick's false quarantine order. She was not a political captive, but a minor administrative inconvenience left to freeze in the bitter northern winter. Evangeline unstoppered the glass pot. She cupped her cracked, ink-stained hands around the vessel and exhaled a long, steady breath over the surface. Her breath plumed white in the frigid air, acting as a temporary hearth for her delicate drafting tools. The frost on the glass slowly receded under the focused warmth. Years of harsh lessons had taught her never to weep before those devoid of empathy. Tears would only freeze on her cheeks, wasting bodily heat she desperately needed for the child growing heavy in her womb. She rested one hand against her side, feeling a slow, rolling kick beneath her wool tunic. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough. Filling every crack, cartographers did not panic when they lost their bearings. They simply remapped their surroundings using whatever landmarks remained. Evangeline shifted her weight on the freezing floor, bringing her knees awkwardly against the rough stones. Her heavy leather bag contained no weapons. It held only vellum, brass compasses, measuring twine, and weighted plummets. She did not need a sword to find a way out of this fabricated quarantine. She needed airflow. Pulling a thin piece of unspun measuring twine from her satchel, the pregnant woman dragged her body toward the massive oak door. She lay on her side, pressing her cheek to the freezing floorboards, and held the twine flat against the narrow gap at the threshold. The string did not lie still. It fluttered outward, pointing sharply toward the eastern wall of the corridor beyond. It was not a random winter draft, but a structural current. Evangeline watched the twine dance, calculating the velocity of the air moving over the stone. A draft that strong, pulling away from the main corridor, meant there was an active, high-pressure ventilation shaft directly beneath the hall floorboards. The ancient fortress was built over thermal springs, and that deep subterranean heat had to escape somewhere. The guards had locked her in the coldest room in the keep, assuming she would huddle in the center and freeze quietly. They did not realize they had placed the Empire's most meticulous architectural reader directly above the fortress's hidden mechanical veins. She carefully wound the twine back around her fingers. The child kicked again, a sharp pressure against her lower ribs, and she placed a steadying hand over the movement. Tomorrow, she would be gone, because she now held the coordinates of her first exit. The heavy scrape of iron boots at the far end of the corridor broke the frozen silence. Evangeline remained on the floor, pressing her ear flat against the stone to amplify the acoustic vibration. She did not shrink away from the noise. Instead, she began to count. 1, 2, 3. The footfalls belonged to Cyrus Thorne. The head steward of the estate moved with a precise, military cadence that separated him from the lazy, dragging steps of the regular garrison. Thorne enforced the Earl's edicts with an administrative coldness that left no room for error. Save for the arrogance of assuming a pregnant cartographer posed no tactical threat. 6, 7, 8. The sound of his boots echoed through the vaulted ceiling, striking the stone exactly twice per second. Evangeline calculated the distance based on the reverberation delay. By the 12th step, the sound muffled slightly, indicating he had passed the heavy wool tapestry in the outer hall. By the 20th step, the vibration shifted from a sharp crack to a deep, hollow thud. The warden was walking over the hollow floorboards of the archive wing directly adjacent to her holding room. He was not patrolling her cell. He was conducting his daily inventory of the private vault. Evangeline leaned heavily against the wall to support her aching back. She moved to the narrow grate set into the center of her heavy oak door. Through the slanted iron slats, she possessed a fragmented view of the archive corridor. The steward stood at the massive iron-banded door of the records room. He pulled a heavy brass key from his belt, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud, metallic clank. He did not take the key with him when he stepped inside. The man pushed the door open, leaving the brass instrument jutting from the lock plate, and disappeared into the dim, paper-scented depths of the archive. Evangeline did not hold her breath. She simply resumed her internal metronome, tracking the exact duration he remained inside. She listened to the rustle of parchment, the shifting of heavy leather binders, and the muffled thud of ledger covers dropping onto wooden desks. She mapped the thickness of the archive door based on how much his boots vibrated through the floorboards while he was inside the adjacent room. The oak had to be at least 4 inches thick, judging by the deadened acoustic return. He stayed inside for exactly 3 minutes before stepping back into the hall. He turned the key, pulled it from the lock, and resumed his march down the corridor without ever looking toward her cell. Evangeline closed her eyes, visualizing the architectural geometry of the hall. The steward's route was fixed. The time the archive key remained exposed in the lock was 3 minutes. The distance from her cell to the archive door was exactly 22 strides for a healthy man, or perhaps 40 slow, careful steps for a woman carrying an unborn child. The loose gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth as she pressed her hands flat against the rough stone wall, pushing herself fully upright. The sharp physical pain was merely data. It told her she was awake, she was alive, and her mind remained her own. Roderick thought he had buried her in this high fortress, stripping her of her standing and leaving her to await a quiet, tragic end. A cartographer never truly loses her maps. She simply builds new ones from the shadows, the drafts, and the careless footsteps of arrogant men. Using the precise 3-minute window she had calculated, Evangeline slipped out of her holding room. The air inside the forbidden archive vault was stagnant, smelling of dried resin and degrading parchment. She moved with a deliberate, calibrated slowness, her soft-soled boots making absolutely no sound against the freezing flagstones. The pale daylight, filtering through the narrow slit windows, provided just enough illumination for a cartographer's trained eyes. She navigated the labyrinth of towering oak shelves by memory. Her breathing was measured, slow inhales and controlled exhales, keeping the erratic flutter of her elevated heart rate from dictating her physical movements. Deep in the restricted section, behind a row of decaying tax ledgers, she found the false back of the lower cabinet. Her fingers sought the hidden latch she had deduced from the wooden frame. A soft click echoed. The panel swung open, revealing a heavy, cylindrical object. She reached in and pulled out a bronze scroll tube. The metal was shockingly cold to the touch and coated in a thin layer of preservation grease. Before doing anything else, she pulled the rough linen sleeve of her work dress over her palm and carefully wiped the grease from the container's surface. She rubbed the metallic exterior in methodical strokes, ensuring none of her own fingerprints would be left behind. If Cyrus Thorne inspected the vault, he would find only the clean sheen of polished bronze. With the cylinder clean, she pressed the release mechanism on the cap. The seal broke with a faint hiss. Inside, tightly rolled and tied with a braided leather cord, lay the river diver charts. Evangeline unrolled the thick parchment over a nearby reading table. Pinning the corners down with 2 heavy iron weights, she leaned close, inhaling the specific scent of the ink. It was not ancient gallnut ink. It was fresh, smelling faintly of copper and soot. The architectural lines detailed a massive engineering project, a systematic rerouting of the primary glacial runoff that fed the capital's municipal water system. More damning were the annotations in the margins, specifying the introduction of toxic mineral tailings into the diverted flow. She did not gasp. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. She traced the primary signature at the bottom of the page. To ensure it was not a forgery, she turned the parchment over and examined the pressure marks bleeding through the back. The heavy, aggressive strokes of the quill were undeniable. She checked the wax seal beside the signature, running her thumb over the raised crest of the boar. The wax was still slightly soft at the center. It was the authentic, unalterable mark of Earl Roderick. This was not a hypothetical defensive strategy. It was an active, documented treason, signed and sealed, a deliberate plot to poison and starve the southern populations. The magnitude of the betrayal required an immediate physical adjustment. Evangeline placed a hand under her swollen abdomen, supporting the aching weight of her unborn child as she shifted her stance. The dull throb in her lower spine made the muscles in her back pull tight like overwound clockwork. She took a slow, deep breath, holding the frigid air in her lungs until the involuntary trembling in her knees subsided. She could not afford panic. Panic was a luxury for women who were not carrying the future heir of the Alpha King in enemy territory. She carefully rolled the treasonous documents back into a tight cylinder, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly, and slid them into the metallic canister. The metallic click of the cap locking into place sounded uncomfortably loud. She turned to her rugged surveyor's pack, a sturdy, scuffed bag designed to protect delicate instruments during long field expeditions. She unbuckled the thick main strap and opened the heavy flap. The carrier was already partially filled with her essential mapping tools, brass compasses, and a small box of graphite sticks. Placing the metal cylinder directly against the iron frame of the bag would create a distinct clanking noise, a sound that would instantly alert any guard in the echoing corridors of Silt-Hold. Evangeline reached into the deep pocket of her wool cloak and pulled out a pair of thick, unworn spare wool socks. With meticulous care, she slid one sock over the bottom half of the heavy container, pulling the elastic knit tight. She stretched the second sock over the top half, overlapping the thick woolen material in the middle. She then nestled the muffled cylinder deep into the center of the satchel, wedging it firmly between a bound stack of blank parchment and her leather journal. She lifted the bag to test the weight. It was heavier now, the dense bronze adding a significant, dragging pull to the leather strap. She slung the harness over her left shoulder, positioning the bag so that it rested against her hip. The heavy field bag bumped gently against her thigh, completely silent. She adjusted her posture, deliberately locking her knees and aligning her spine to counterbalance the combined weight of her late-stage pregnancy and the heavy evidence she now carried. Every step would require conscious biomechanical control. If she leaned too far backward, her balance would falter. If she leaned too far forward, the bag would swing and throw her off stride. She stood absolutely still in the gloom of the archive, her eyes tracing the path back to the main door. A lifetime of concealing her vulnerabilities from callous men had fortified her spirit, and she was not about to start weeping over the physical pain of her burdened body now. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, and the ink in that satchel was the only thing that could save her child. She tightened her grip on the thick strap, her knuckles whitening, preparing to walk back out into the fortress as if she were carrying nothing more than blank paper. But before she could take her first step, the measured, unhurried scrape of leather soles against the flagstones echoed from the corridor. She did not freeze, nor did she scramble for a hiding place. The royal cartographer simply shifted her posture, pulling the satchel slightly behind the drape of her heavy wool maternity cloak. The archway was illuminated by a single tallow candle, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Cyrus Thorne stepped into the narrow halo of light. The head steward did not carry a weapon. He wore his pristine grey coat, a ledger book tucked neatly under one arm, his face a mask of supreme bureaucratic indifference. The man stopped just at the threshold, his pale eyes sweeping over the rows of bookshelves before settling on the pregnant woman standing in the gloom. He did not shout. He did not issue a threat, nor did he demand to know what she was doing in a restricted wing. His cruelty was far more meticulous than raw physical aggression. The steward merely reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a large iron ring of keys. "The quarantine orders have been updated," Thorne stated, his voice flat and perfectly modulated, echoing slightly against the vaulted ceiling. "The lower archives are to be sealed due to dampness." Evangeline watched him carefully, her hand resting over the curve of her stomach. She calculated the distance between her position at the desk and the threshold where he stood. It was 20 paces. Even without the heavy burden of her unborn child, she could never bridge that gap before he acted. The steward turned his back to her, grasping the heavy iron handles of the towering oak double doors. He pulled them shut with a slow, grinding groan of hinges that had not been oiled in decades. The thick wood obscured him from view, plunging the archive into a deeper, suffocating twilight. From the other side, the metallic mechanics of her entrapment began. She listened as a massive brass bar was lifted from its resting place on the corridor floor. The sound of it sliding into the deep iron brackets bolted across the exterior of the doors was unmistakable. It was a heavy, decisive thud that vibrated through the floorboards beneath her boots. Thorne was not treating her as a dangerous prisoner of war. He was treating her as a misplaced crate of grain, locking her away in the dark to be forgotten until it was convenient to deal with her. The finality of the lock clicking into place was absolute. The heavy resonance of the brass bar settling into its brackets sent a violent tremor through the air, and then, immediately, through Evangeline's body. It was not a flutter. It was not a warning ache. The shock of the sudden, total confinement hit her nervous system like a hammer, striking an anvil, plunging straight into her lower abdomen. Her breath caught in her throat as the muscles across her swollen belly seized in a sudden, brutal contraction. The pain was a blinding, encompassing band of pressure that forced her to drop to one knee, her fingers clawing at the edge of the reading desk to keep from collapsing entirely. She had spent months reading medical texts on the royal estate, preparing for a birth in the safety of Alpha King Gideon's protected chambers. This was too early. The frigid air of Silt-Hold and the sheer spike of adrenaline had broken the fragile equilibrium of her pregnancy. The cartographer forced herself to stand, dragging her boots across the uneven stones until her back hit the freezing masonry of the archive wall. The cold seeped immediately through her cloak, shocking her skin, but she welcomed the grounding sensation. She needed an anchor. Across the room, a rusted condensation pipe dripped steadily into a shallow stone basin. Ping, ping, ping! Evangeline closed her eyes and let her head fall back against the wall, listening to the rhythm. She did not allow herself to panic. Panic was a luxury for women who had someone coming to save them. Instead, the young mother turned her agony into a mathematical variable. She breathed in through her nose, counting the drips. The contraction crested, pulling at her spine with an agonizing weight, and then slowly began to recede after 45 drops of water. When the pain finally ebbed, leaving her trembling and slick with cold sweat, she opened her eyes. The reinforced carrier had slipped down her arm, the heavy bronze cylinder bumping against her hip. She adjusted the strap, pulling it diagonally across her chest so the weight was distributed away from her seizing abdomen. The main exit was gone, The brass bar was impenetrable from the inside, but her mind held the exact blueprints of Silt-Hold, every line and measurement she had secretly memorized. The fortress was ancient, heated by a network of narrow utility channels that carried steam from the lower boilers to the upper floors. She turned her gaze toward the eastern corner of the vault, where a large, rusted iron grate was bolted into the masonry near the floor. It was the ventilation intake for the archive. Another wave of tightening began, low and demanding, gathering strength in her pelvis. She pressed her hand against the wall, her knuckles whitening against the rough stone. She counted the condensation drops again, her breath misting in the freezing air. 30 drips this time. The intervals were closing faster than the medical texts had predicted. The isolated woman did not cry out. She simply waited for the pressure to release, then pushed herself away from the wall. The satchel was heavy. Her body was in active rebellion, but the documents required to destroy Earl Roderick were safe against her side. She began the slow, agonizing walk toward the iron grate. Covering the primary ventilation shaft, the heavy metal lattice was secured with simple lead seals, not locks. Evangeline knelt on the rough flagstones, her breathing measured and shallow as she assessed it. She understood the structural anatomy of Silt-Hold far better than the soldiers, who blindly patrolled its halls. The architectural blueprints of the fortress were permanently carved into her memory, lines drawn in meticulous indigo ink on heavy drafting parchment back in the sovereign archives. With the main corridors entirely compromised by Thorn's lockdown, the only remaining artery, leading out of the sealed wing toward the central courtyard, bypassed the guard rotations completely. It was the subterranean utility channel, a dangerously narrow crawlway built solely to carry the boiling steam pipes from the deep furnaces to the upper keeps. The ambient temperature near the floor vent was already stifling, pressing against her face like a physical weight. The stagnant air smelled of wet rust, mineral scale, and the sharp metallic bite of hot copper. The cartographer unbuckled her heavy carrying case and set it carefully against the stone wall. The bag was scarred and weathered, a pragmatic instrument constructed for harsh northern field work rather than decorative court display, yet it currently held the absolute ruin of Earl Roderick's treasonous house. Her fingers moved with deliberate, practiced efficiency as she tore thick, sturdy strips of wool from the heavy hem of her inner winter skirt. The brass steam valves regulating the pressure inside the shaft would be hot enough to severely blister human skin upon mere contact. She wrapped the torn fabric tightly around her palms and knuckles, binding them into thick, makeshift gauntlets. The wool was coarse and unyielding, scratching uncomfortably against the delicate skin of her wrists, but it would provide the essential thermal insulation. The pregnant woman pressed her wrapped hands firmly against the rusted iron grate and applied a steady, calculated pressure. The metal groaned in protest, scraping loudly against the tight stone collar before finally giving way. A sudden blast of humid, scalding air washed over her face, instantly plastering her dark hair against her forehead and forcing her lungs to tighten. The exposed entrance was a narrow, unforgiving square of darkness, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing orange glow of the distant boiler fires reflecting off the damp brickwork. She reached down, gripping the sturdy strap of the heavy satchel. Every mathematical calculation in her disciplined mind confirmed the brutal geometry of the enclosed space. The horizontal shaft was precisely 24 inches wide, meaning her heavily swollen stomach would clear the intersecting steam pipes by barely a fraction of an inch, provided she maintained perfect alignment with the curved masonry. She lowered her shoulders into the humid dark, allowing the oppressive heat to swallow her whole. The primary brass valve wheel served as her first anchor. Her wool-wrapped fingers clamped around the scalding metal, the thick fabric smoking faintly against the extreme temperature as she pulled her weary body forward into the long, suffocating tunnel. The physical reality of the crawlway immediately asserted its dominance over her exhausted muscles. The floor beneath her knees was slick with centuries of condensation, making the uneven stone treacherous. Above her, the massive iron pipes hissed, venting small plumes of white steam that stung her shoulders through the thin linen of her blouse. The confined space forced her into a creeping posture. She had to keep her spine hollowed, curving her back awkwardly to prevent her abdomen from scraping against the jagged mortar of the lower joints. The contractions that had seized her earlier subsided into a low, continuous, radiating ache across her lower back, a deep rhythm that dictated the measured pace of her grueling advance. Her primary concern was not the blistering heat or the bruising stone, but the strict preservation of the evidence. The weather-beaten knapsack contained the ancient metal cylinder, and any exposure to the pooling water on the tunnel floor could potentially compromise the structural integrity of the forged seals within. Dragging the bag beside her was impossible. The corridor was simply too narrow. Pushing it ahead meant risking it sliding into the deep puddles of mineral runoff that collected in the depressions of the brickwork. Approaching a particularly tight masonry joint where the ceiling dipped ominously low, Evangeline paused. The gap required her to flatten her posture almost completely, a physical demand that seemed structurally impossible for a woman in the final days of carrying a child. She assessed the geometry of the bottleneck with clinical detachment. If she angled her hips slightly to the left, allowing the curve of her stomach to rest within the concave shadow of the main steam conduit, she could slide through. But she needed both of her wool-wrapped hands free to grip the slippery brickwork for traction. Without hesitation, she lifted the thick, braided strap of the satchel and clamped it firmly between her teeth. The immediate taste was foul, a mixture of old-cured hide, bitter copper dust, and the damp rot of the fortress foundations. The heavy weight of the sovereign vessel inside pulled sharply at her jaw, straining the muscles in her neck, but the bag remained suspended safely above the wet sludge of the floor. She began to squeeze through the bottleneck. The rough masonry scraped mercilessly against her shoulders, tearing the fabric of her outer bodice. The heat in this constricted section was suffocating, turning the air into a thick, unbreathable soup that burned the back of her throat. Every inch of forward progress was a calculated victory of physics over pain. Her knees ground into the slick brick, finding purchase in the shallow mortar grooves. The leather strap bit deeply into her gums, but she refused to open her mouth, absolutely refusing to let the vital documents touch the ruinous damp. Slowly, her hips cleared the narrowest point of the joint. The ceiling opened up by a mere handful of inches, but it was enough to allow her to lower her head and release the strap from her aching jaw. She spat the bitter taste of copper onto the stones, her chest heaving as she dragged the heavy satchel forward and secured it tightly against her chest. The exit grating lay just ahead in the dark, marked by a thin sliver of freezing northern daylight. Pushing through the final few feet, she shoved against the barrier. The heavy iron grate gave way with a harsh, metallic scrape that seemed deafening in the tight utility passage. Evangeline pushed her shoulders through the narrow aperture, dragging her torso out of the suffocating, humid heat of the mechanical crawlway. The transition was violent and immediate. She did not emerge into a place of safety. She emerged directly into the brutal teeth of the northern winter. The sub-zero wind howling through the outer courtyard of Silt-Hold hit her damp skin like a physical blow. Inside the subterranean tunnels, the thick steam had soaked through her dark linen maternity dress, pasting the fabric to her spine and dampening her dark hair. Now, that same moisture became a severe liability. The residual heat clinging to her face met the freezing atmospheric pressure of the open grounds. Within seconds, the heavy condensate crystallized. Thick white frost formed instantly on her eyelashes. The sudden ice glued the fine hairs together, turning the imposing, shadow-draped architecture of the fortress into a smeared grey haze. Evangeline paused, her breath catching in her throat, and blinked repeatedly. The sharp, abrasive friction of ice scraping against ice forced a stinging warmth back into her eyes. She blinked again, executing a slow and deliberate sequence, clearing the frozen moisture just enough to visually map the immense, desolate space ahead. She turned her upper body back toward the open vent, reaching her raw hands into the dark, steaming opening. The metal-bound bag was wedged tightly against the rough masonry. It took 3 sharp, calculated tugs to dislodge the baggage. The heavy metal corners scraped against the stone lip, producing a jarring sound that was quickly swallowed by the howling gale. She pulled the bag to her chest, securing the thick leather strap diagonally across her shoulder to distribute the weight away from her swollen abdomen. The satchel was significantly heavier now, burdened with the absolute proof of treason. Every inhalation felt like swallowing crushed glass. The freezing air burned the delicate lining of her throat, forcing her to regulate her breathing into shallow, measured intervals. She pressed her forearm against her waist, supporting the heavy, downward pressure of her pregnancy. The cold was not merely a temperature in this northern territory. It was a solid, oppressive structure, attempting to crush whatever heat remained inside her. Evangeline adjusted the strap of the satchel one final time, letting the cold iron buckle rest flat against her collarbone. She looked at the distant, warmly lit windows of the banquet hall. The powerful men sitting behind that glass had no idea what was currently moving through the storm. Evangeline shifted her weight forward, lowering her hands to the ground. The snow covering the courtyard was deceptively deep, hiding the jagged landscaping stones that lined the outer perimeter. As she pressed her palms downward, the frozen crust of the snowpack broke under her weight. The gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth. She did not pull her hands back. She let the sharp edges of the buried stone anchor her against the fierce crosswind. Walking upright was a tactical impossibility. The sharp contraction that had originated in the archive now wrapped entirely around her lower spine, forcing her center of gravity downward with brutal insistence. Standing in the gale would only expose her to the full force of the wind and drain the tiny reserve of heat keeping her muscles functioning. Crawling across the isolated expanse was not a submission to the elements. It was a meticulous calculation of survival. The heavy field pack dragged heavily through the snowdrifts, acting as a relentless anchor pulling at her shoulder. She needed leverage to maintain momentum. Her bare fingers were rapidly losing sensation, the skin taking on a mottled, dangerous pale blue tint. Evangeline stopped her forward motion and unbuckled the main flap of her bag with stiff, unresponsive thumbs. She did not reach for the fragile parchment ledgers inside. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket and withdrew the sealed cylindrical vault. The ancient metal cylinder was incredibly dense, forged to survive fire and water, capped with thick, unbroken wax seals. She gripped the middle of the heavy vessel, pulling it free from the leather confines. Evangeline leaned forward and planted the heavy metal tip of the tubes directly into the hard, packed snow. She drove it downward with sharp force until it struck the solid gravel beneath, testing its stability against the icy ground. It held firm. Using the heavy bronze container as a makeshift cane, she braced her upper body against it and dragged her knees forward through the deep snow. The rhythm became a mechanical mantra. Plant the cylinder, test the purchase, pull the body, drag the satchel. The wind screamed through the high battlements of the fortress, but she tuned out the chaotic noise. She focused entirely on the tactile feedback of the metal tube striking the frozen earth. Her breathing synchronized with her movements. Inhale on the reach, exhale on the pull. She refused to focus on the deep ache radiating through her abdomen, nor the biting cold systematically destroying the living tissue of her hands. She focused entirely on the architectural coordinates. The grand oak doors of the High Court were exactly 42 yards away. She knew the precise distance because she had mapped the dimensions of the estate herself. 42 yards. Every solid strike of the bronze scroll tube closed that gap. The freezing storm was actively trying to bury her, sweeping fresh snow over her tracks the moment they were made. But the deep, methodical groove she left, dragging her body through the drifts, proved she was still advancing. She was not a victim trapped in a storm. She was a royal cartographer carrying the legal destruction of an entire bloodline, and she was going to deliver it. Looming ahead, the immense double doors of the grand solstice banquet stood at the apex of the southern gallery stairs, constructed from dense, dark oak and bound in heavy wrought iron. 2 of Roderick's ceremonial sentries flanked the entrance, their halberds resting at severe, formal angles, their uniforms crisp and untouched by the northern winter raging outside. When Evangeline reached the top of the stone steps, her breathing was shallow, measured carefully through parted lips, dictated not by panic, but by the sheer mechanical effort required to remain upright. She leaned her shoulder against the nearest pillar. The sentries stepped forward, their polearms crossing with a sharp metallic clack to block her path. Yet, as they registered the figure standing before them, their rigid discipline faltered. They were trained to intercept armed assassins, rogue lords, or aggressive emissaries. They had no protocol for a heavily pregnant woman coated entirely in boiler soot, smelling of freezing ozone, and swaying under the weight of a bulky expedition pack. She did not ask for their permission to enter. She did not speak at all. Evangeline simply shifted her weight, pressed her soot-stained shoulder against the heavy oak timber, and pushed. The right door gave way, groaning outward on its massive iron hinges. The sudden breach unleashed a suffocating blast of heat from the banquet hall, hitting her face like a physical blow. The air inside was dense, practically heavy, with the aroma of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the cloying floral perfumes favored by the sovereign delegates. The massive hearths along the side walls roared with stacked cedar logs, radiating a dry, oppressive warmth. It was a jarring, almost nauseating contrast to the bitter cold and the metallic taste of blood she had swallowed for the past hour. The transition in temperature was violent and immediate. Within seconds, the thick crust of frost that had armored her ruined wool coat began to thaw. She stood on the threshold, her knuckles white around the strap of her bag, as the frozen mixture of courtyard snow and utility channel ash turned rapidly to liquid. Heavy drops fell from her hem. They struck the pristine white marble border of the entryway, leaving stark, dark rings of soot water pooling around her boots. The vibrant string music echoing from the elevated minstrel gallery did not stop at once. It unraveled. A single cellist noticed her first, his bow scraping a harsh, dissonant note before he lowered his instrument entirely. The silence cascaded outward from the doors. The low, confident murmur of hundreds of lords, regional beatus, and imperial arbiters died out in a creeping wave, rippling from the back of the hall all the way to the high table. Goblets were lowered, conversations fractured mid-sentence. Evangeline gripped the strap tighter, ignoring the way the frozen leather bit into her palm. She did not look at the stunned faces of the nobility turning toward her in the candlelight. Her gaze locked solely on the elevated dais at the far end of the vast room, where Earl Roderick sat draped in heavy crimson velvet. Her first step past the marble threshold was a miscalculation of her own failing biology. A massive contraction seized the lower half of her abdomen, folding her forward with the blunt force of a physical strike. Her knees hit the ground, the impact driving a sharp spike of agony up her spine. Beyond the white entryway border, the main floor of the High Court was paved entirely in polished black obsidian. It was a flawless, mirror-like expanse, designed to reflect the hundreds of flickering beeswax candles suspended in the massive iron chandeliers above. The lords and ladies nearest to the doors immediately stepped back, their silk skirts and velvet coats rustling as they cleared a wide path, treating her sudden collapse as though it were a contagious disease. Evangeline did not attempt to stand back up. The pain was too absolute, anchoring her center of gravity to the floor. Instead, she flattened one soot-stained hand against the sleek, cold stone. She dragged her body forward. Her heavy, soaked linen skirts whispered against the glass, smooth surface. Behind her, the leather satchel scraped against the obsidian, issuing a low, grinding screech that echoed through the utterly silent hall. It was the only sound in the cavernous room. She crawled to his enemy's throne. Each forward movement required a calculated exhalation, forcing her lungs to empty before her muscles could contract again. The gravel from the outer courtyard had embedded itself deep into her palms, and now that grit pressed painfully against the polished floor with every inch she gained. She kept her bag tucked securely near her side, protecting the documents it held with the curve of her body, shielding it just as fiercely as she shielded her unborn pup. Halfway across the vast expanse, the pressure within her reached a critical limit. Her body made its final biological demand. A sharp, localized rupture occurred deep within her pelvis, and her water broke in a cold, silent rush. The fluid soaked instantly through the remaining dry layers of her clothing, flooding out onto the black stone beneath her. The amniotic fluid mixed freely with the melting snow, and ash still clinging to her coat. As she pulled herself forward another foot, dragging her dead weight closer to the dais, she left a distinct, dark, wet trail across the highly reflective obsidian. The long, smeared path caught the amber light of the chandeliers above, fracturing their perfect, symmetrical reflections into jagged, watery lines. She did not pause to hide the visceral reality of her condition. Long ago, she had trained herself never to shed tears for those incapable of compassion. There was no room left for humiliation, only the mathematics of distance and survival. She merely set her jaw and forced her bleeding knees to slide her another inch closer to the high table. At the head of the room, Roderick stood up slowly from his carved wooden chair. His hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark wood. The confident posture he had maintained all evening evaporated, replaced by a rigid, breathless stillness. Beside the Earl, Ronald Vance remained seated at the imperial table. The arbiter's posture was perfectly straight, his expression unreadable as his eyes tracked the dark trail of fluid marking the floor, calculating the precise legal disruption her arrival represented. Evangeline did not stop crawling until the heavy shadow of the throne finally fell over her face. She let her body drop against the lowest step of the dais where Earl Roderick sat, the impact driving the breath from her lungs in a harsh hiss. The heat of the grand banquet hall was stifling, heavy with the scent of roasted venison and the overpowering perfumed oils of the northern elite. Above her, the initial collective gasp of the assembled lords had fractured into a chaotic murmur. Silk robes rustled furiously as lesser nobles leaned forward, caught between disgust at her soiled garments and sheer confusion. Roderick half rose from his carved oak chair, his silver-ringed hands gripping the armrests tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to summon the armored guards, but Evangeline did not give him the space to speak. Her focus narrowed completely to the battered drafting bag clutched in her right hand. The thick canvas strap had carved a deep trench into her shoulder, throbbing in rhythm with her racing pulse. Her fingers, numb from the freezing snow and stained dark with soot, worked the heavy brass buckles. The stiff material resisted her frozen joints, but she forced the flap open with a violent pull. She did not look up at the furious Earl. She did not clutch her swollen abdomen or cry out for a healer, even as another grinding contraction coiled at the base of her spine. Instead, she reached deep into the protected interior of the bag and closed her fingers around cold, ancient metal. With a deliberate movement, she hauled the bronze scroll tube free. It was exceptionally heavy, weighted with sovereign history and sealed with thick layers of untouched crimson wax. She lifted the container just high enough to clear the edge of the first step, then let it drop. The heavy cylinder hit the obsidian floor with a dull, resonant ring. The metallic impact was not loud, but the meticulous acoustic architecture of the high court carried the low frequency outward. The sound vibrated straight through the thick wooden legs of the massive high table, rattling the crystal wine goblets and silencing the whispering lords in an absolute instant. By releasing the object onto the floor, before the long table, she was officially submitting it into the court's formal custody. It was a precise administrative maneuver, declaring that the item now belonged to the jurisdiction of the crown. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. These men would never understand a mother's terror. But they understood property. They understood protocol. Her first physical action in the enemy's hall was not a frantic plea for her child's life, but the flawless execution of a legal chain of custody. The silence in the hall was absolute, save for the crackle of the hearth fires and the ragged sound of Evangeline's breathing. She kept her chin tucked, waiting for the peak of the contraction to recede. The pain radiated through her lower back, a crushing vice of muscle and bone. She counted the seconds in her head, mapping the duration of the pain exactly as she would map a topographical elevation. When the agonizing spike finally began to plateau, she planted her soot-stained hands flat against the cold stone and pushed her upper body upright. She did not address the man on the throne. She turned her gaze slightly to the left, locking her exhausted eyes onto the stiff, highly decorated figure of Ronald Vance. The Imperial Arbiter sat at the center of the neutral delegation, his posture rigid, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the metal container resting near his boots. "Arbiter," Evangeline said. Her voice was low, scraped raw by the freezing wind and the toxic steam of the utility tunnels, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of an official reporting to a superior. "I demand a formal examination of the sovereign seals upon that vessel." Roderick found his voice, a sharp bark of outrage cutting through the hall. "Silence this madwoman! Guards, seize her, and that stolen property at once." Two armored sentries stepped forward from the shadows, their hands dropping to the hilts of their swords, but they froze when Vance raised a single, gloved hand. The official's gesture was slight, yet it carried the weight of the entire Imperial court. He did not look at the Earl. He kept his gaze locked on the pregnant cartographer kneeling on the floor. "On what grounds?" Vance asked, his tone devoid of personal sympathy, operating purely on the mechanics of administrative law. "On the grounds of high treason against the crown," she answered, timing her words meticulously. She took a slow, calculated breath, feeling the next wave of pressure building in her abdomen, and spoke before it could steal her voice completely. "Contained within that cylinder are the original, unalterable river divert charts for the northern basin. They bear the unauthorized personal signature of Earl Blackwood. A collective intake of breath swept through the neutral delegation. To alter the municipal water supply routes without royal decree was an act of war designed to poison the capital's downstream territories. Lies, Roderick roared, his polished boots striking the dais. "She is a delirious prisoner breaking quarantine, a spy attempting to forge documents. Evangeline did not flinch. The charts are mapped on imperial vellum, stamped with the Silt-Hold archival watermark, and secured beneath 200 years of unbroken wax. A forgery of that physical age and chemical composition is an impossibility within a 14-day containment. She paused, her jaw tightening as the next contraction hit her, forcing her to lock her elbows to remain upright. She waited 3 seconds, refusing to let the pain break her composure. Break the seal, Arbiter. Verify the ink. The law requires you to inspect submitted evidence before an execution of force. Her defense was a fortress built of procedure. By invoking the specific statutes of evidence verification, she forced the neutral officials to act based on rigid laws rather than appealing to their non-existent mercy. She was not a helpless Omega begging a hostile court for salvation. She was a royal employee submitting undeniable proof of a conspiracy. The physical agony was immense, threatening to tear her apart, but her mind remained cold, sharp, and entirely sovereign. She watched Vance slowly lean forward, his gloved fingers reaching toward the metal tube. Knowing that the moment he touched it, the Earl's power was legally extinguished. The silence that fell over the Grand Solstice banquet was not the kind that followed a sudden shock. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a trap springing shut, thick with the scent of roasted venison and sudden cold dread. Ronald Vance did not rush. The Imperial Arbiter moved with the unhurried precision of a man who measured his life in iron-bound ledgers and royal ink. He stepped down from the high table, his heavy woolen robes brushing against the polished obsidian floor, and approached the dais where the unrolled river divert charts lay exposed. Roderick Blackwood stood frozen. The Earl's posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, but his eyes tracked the older man's every movement. Vance knelt beside the ancient parchment. He ignored the panting, exhausted woman bleeding onto the stone nearby, not out of cruelty, but because his jurisdiction demanded absolute focus on the evidence. From the inner pocket of his coat, the official withdrew a small, folding brass magnifier. The metal caught the ambient candlelight, gleaming dull gold in the freezing hall. With methodical care, Vance lowered the lens toward the heavy puddle of crimson sealing wax binding the bottom edge of the treasonous blueprints. Evangeline watched him through the haze of a fresh contraction. The pain biting into her lower spine was blinding, sweeping through her nervous system like a winter storm, but she did not close her eyes. She focused on the steady, mathematical movements of the Arbiter. She had bet her life, and the life of her unborn child, on the premise that bureaucracy was a sharper weapon than a blade. "These are territorial schematics," Vance noted, his voice carrying the dry, hollow acoustics of a tomb, detailing the municipal aqueducts of the capital. The diversion routes are clearly marked in indigo. He adjusted the brass magnifier, leaning closer. He was not looking at the treasonous lines. He was looking at the microscopic imperfections pressed into the wax. The Blackwood crest, a rearing stag encircled by thorned vines, was unmistakable, but Vance was searching for the distinct, hairline fracture known to exist on the Earl's personal signet ring. It was a microscopic flaw passed down through 3 generations of lords, a defect that could not be forged by a lesser scribe or a clever spy. The scrape of the brass rim against the stone floor echoed like a hammer strike. Vance exhaled slowly, his breath plumbing in the drafty air. He shifted his gaze to the signature inked beside the seal, comparing the harsh, jagged downstrokes of the lettering to the standard treaties he had memorized decades ago. Roderick finally found his voice, a low, arrogant sneer that betrayed a tremor of genuine panic. "This is a fabrication, a desperate lie brought by a deranged trespasser trying to save her own skin." The Arbiter did not look up. He merely rotated the magnifier to inspect the binding ribbon woven through the parchment. The thread was dyed in the specific extract permitted only within the fortress's walls. The evidence was absolute, anchoring the truth in material reality rather than emotional testimony. "The wax bears the fractured antler of the Blackwood signet," Vance stated quietly, folding his brass tool with a definitive click. "The ink is aged with the estate's proprietary iron gall mixture. The river divert charts are authentic. That single, measured sentence dismantled centuries of feudal immunity in the span of a breath." The arbiter rose to his feet, his spine rigidly straight. He turned his back on the disgraced lord, an act of supreme administrative contempt, and signaled to the head scribe waiting at the edge of the high table. The scribe immediately opened the massive, leather-bound, active treaty ledger that governed the Northern Territories. The sound of thick vellum pages turning was the only noise in the cavernous hall, heavy and final. "By the authority of the Imperial Court," Vance declared, his voice devoid of anger, devoid of anything but procedural finality, "Silt-Hold is hereby stripped of its sovereign treaty protections. The Blackwood lineage is severed from the Crown's grace. You possess no rank, no land, and no right of parley." Roderick's face drained of colour, leaving his skin the shade of dirty winter snow. For a man who had built his entire existence on intimidation and inherited dominance, the sudden evaporation of his legal existence was incomprehensible. His hand dropped instinctively to his hip, his fingers wrapping around the gilded hilt of his ceremonial sword. The leather grip groaned under his tightening fist. For a fraction of a second, the tension in the room spiked into raw violence. Evangeline forced her breathing to remain shallow, her body tensed against the freezing floor, waiting for the fatal swing of the blade. But Roderick hesitated. He looked at the high table. The elderly clerk had not reached for a weapon. Instead, the man dipped a heavy iron-nibbed quill into a pot of black ink. With a slow, deliberate motion, the scribe drew a thick, wet line straight through the name, written in the registry. The scratch of the metal nib, tearing slightly into the vellum, was louder than a war horn. The sword, half drawn from its scabbard, stopped moving. The Earl realized the terrifying truth of the moment. Killing the arbiter would not unsign the ledger. Slicing through the scribe would not restore the broken seal. Violence was suddenly, utterly useless against the sheer machinery of the law. The surrounding lords, men who had drank his wine and laughed at his jokes mere minutes ago, physically stepped back. The entire hall oriented away from him, putting cold stone between their boots and a man who no longer legally existed. Before the disgraced Earl could even process his sudden ruin, the massive oak doors of the grand solstice banquet hall swung open with a heavy groaning glide, pushed by hands that carried the absolute authority of the crown. A bitter rush of northern wind swept into the chamber, extinguishing the perimeter candles and carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine over the stale odour of spilled wine. Alpha King Gideon Alistair walked into the hostile fortress. He did not come flanked by howling wolves. He did not bring drawn steel, burning torches, or the chaotic violence of a territorial raid. Instead, he brought the crushing, undeniable weight of sovereign law. Behind him marched a legion of royal barristers, magistrates, and treasury wardens. They wore the austere, high-collared grey wool of the central administration, their chests adorned with the silver chains of their offices. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. There was no shouting, no posturing for dominance. They simply fanned out across the room, forming an impenetrable wall of bureaucratic execution. In their hands, the officers carried heavy leather-bound lockboxes. The brass corners of the cases gleamed dully, the thick leather scuffed from years of transport between high courts. With methodical precision, the wardens approached the long banquet tables. They did not ask for permission. They swept aside silver goblets, plates of half-eaten venison, and crystal decanters, clearing broad spaces on the wood. The synchronized, heavy thuds of the iron-reinforced chests hitting the tables echoed through the silent hall like the closing of a tomb. The click of the latches opening was the loudest sound in the room. Inside the boxes lay royal tax records, lineage registries, and sealed sovereign decrees. The barristers began lifting stacks of thick vellum, untying the black and red ribbons binding the ledgers. This was not a battle. It was an eviction. It was the complete, systematic dismantling of a noble house, executed through paper, ink, and precedent. Gideon occupied the silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He did not draw a weapon. The sheer administrative force of his retinue had already paralyzed the room. The local nobility stared in dawning horror at the ledgers. They understood, with a sudden sinking clarity, that swords could be fought, but a sovereign audit backed by the crown meant total erasure. One warden unrolled a massive parchment map, pinning it flat against the damp wood of the table. She pulled a silver compass from her pocket and began measuring the exact coordinates of the Silt-Hold borders, verifying the jurisdiction for the asset seizure. The quiet scratch of her quill was deafening. The monarch had not come to conquer the fortress. He had come to repossess it. The air grew heavy under the pressure of the king's unhurried presence. His gaze swept across the high table, but he did not look at the imperial arbiters. He bypassed the politics entirely, searching the shadows of the floor until he found what he had actually come for. Gideon moved. His long, deliberate strides ate up the distance across the high court in seconds. He ignored the frantic whispering of the peripheral lords. He walked past the central dais, where Vance was still examining the bronze scroll tube. The politics of the realm, the treason, the military implications. None of it mattered in the face of the physical reality on the ground. He reached the center of the hall, where Evangeline lay crumpled on the freezing, wet obsidian. Without a moment of hesitation, the Alpha King dropped to his knees. The expensive fabrics of his royal garments, the heavy midnight blue wool, the silk lining, the dark velvet, immediately absorbed the freezing mixture of melted snow, soot, and amniotic fluid pooling on the stone. He did not flinch as the dirty water soaked through his trousers, staining the immaculate symbols of his rank. The most powerful man in the Northern Territory surrendered his posture entirely. Bowing his large frame over her shivering body, he pulled off his thick leather riding gloves, tossing them carelessly onto the wet floor. His large, calloused hands that had just authorized the legal death of a territory, reached out with excruciating gentleness. He touched her freezing temple. The sudden, intense warmth of his bare skin against her icy face drew a sharp, involuntary gasp from her lungs. He brushed the damp, soot-caked strands of hair away from her eyes, his thumb mapping the ridge of her cheekbone, as if memorizing the toll the escape had taken on her. "I am here," he said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, pitched entirely for her ears, cutting beneath the chaotic noise of the room. It was not a command. It was an anchor. Evangeline's jaw trembled. Another contraction gripped her abdomen, turning her muscles to stone, and she curled inward with a choked breath. Her fingers, raw and bleeding from the gravel of the courtyard, twitched against the floor. She tried to speak, to give him a precise report of the charts, to confirm that the coordinates were secured. Her analytical mind was still fighting the war. "The blueprints," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "The western tributary." "Hush," Gideon interrupted softly. He shifted his weight, blocking the draft of the open doors with his broad shoulders. He slid one warm hand to the nape of her neck, supporting her heavy head, while the other rested lightly, protectively over the tight mound of her stomach. "The math is done, Evangeline. The borders are closed. You do not have to count anymore." He leaned closer, his scent, sharp cedar, cold ozone, and the deep resinous warmth of a safe hearth, enveloping her completely. It chased away the smell of stale wine and sweat. For the first time since she had been locked in the archives, the frantic, tactical calculations in her mind began to slow. The lords and the arbiters watched in stunned silence as the sovereign ignored the collapse of a kingdom to count the breaths of a cartographer. He did not demand her strength. He simply offered his own, waiting patiently on the wet stone as the contraction crested and finally began to recede. Gideon Alistair did not draw a weapon. He did not issue a roar of challenge, nor did he allow his pack aura to crush the breath from the men standing frozen in the hall. Such displays were the crude instruments of lesser men. The Alpha King fought his wars with absolute, systematic precision. Today, he would raise an entire territory to ash without striking a single spark. The royal barristers fanned out behind their sovereign, their movements sharp and synchronized. They opened thick ledgers, bound in crown leather, the crisp rustle of pages cutting through the suffocating silence. Roderick Blackwood stood at the high table, his aristocratic face slick with the sudden sweat of a man who realized his thick stone walls could not protect him. The Earl stepped forward, his boots scraping clumsily against the floor. He raised a shaking hand, preparing to demand a trial by combat, or cite territorial immunity. Gideon did not even look at him. Instead, the sovereign withdrew a wax-sealed parchment from his tailored coat. It was the sovereign writ of attainder. The document itself seemed to absorb the ambient light, thick with the weight of absolute legal authority. It was an instrument used so rarely that most provincial lords considered it a dark myth. The writ did not merely punish a traitor. It legally erased their entire existence from the registries of the living. Without a word directed at the man whose life he was ending, he handed the decree to his chief barrister. His voice was a low, unhurried drawl that carried effortlessly across the freezing air. "Read it into the permanent record," the monarch commanded. His dark gaze remained fixed on the empty space just above the Earl's shoulder, looking straight through him as if Roderick had already ceased to exist. The chief barrister unrolled the heavy parchment. By the absolute authority of the Crown, and upon irrefutable documentary proof of treason against the treaties of the realm, the noble bloodline of Blackwood is hereby dissolved. All holdings, financial assets, grain stores, water rights, and fortress walls, previously under the jurisdiction of Silt-Hold, are immediately seized in perpetuity by the sovereign throne. Roderick's jaw slackened. The arrogant lord who had built his power on intimidation and inherited privilege now found himself standing in a terrifying vacuum. He had prepared for a military siege. He did not know how to fight a war executed with ink, ledgers, and the administrative absolute zero of royal law. "You cannot do this," the former lord stammered, his voice thin and hollow. "My lineage goes back 3 centuries. You cannot simply wipe us out with a single signature." Gideon finally allowed his gaze to drift downward, landing on the hyperventilating man for a fraction of a second. The sovereign's expression remained entirely blank. "The signature is already dry. You own nothing. You command no one. You are a ghost trespassing on crown property." The treasury wardens immediately moved forward, operating with the terrifying efficiency of men who had dismantled empires before. They began confiscating the ceremonial sigils from the stone pillars, taking inventory of the banquet tables, and seizing the territorial ledgers. The burning of the kingdom was fully underway. It was a bloodless, systematic conflagration that consumed titles, ancestral wealth, and recorded history faster than any physical fire ever could. Roderick collapsed back into his carved wooden chair, utterly powerless to stop the machinery of the state as it erased his legacy piece by piece. With the legal destruction of Silt-Hold operating in the background, Gideon turned his back on the ruined lord. His terrifyingly calm demeanor fractured the moment his eyes returned to the exhausted woman kneeling on the obsidian floor. He dropped to one knee beside Evangeline Sterling, the polished stone reflecting the urgent shift in his posture. He unclasped the heavy metal fastening at his throat, pulling the heated silk cloak from his own shoulders. It was a masterpiece of royal engineering, woven with microscopic thermal threads and lined with the softest winter fur, designed to maintain core temperature in the most brutal northern blizzards. He wrapped the massive garment around Evangeline's shivering, heavily pregnant form. The moment the silk draped over her shoulders, the thermal threads began to hum softly. It was a faint, rhythmic vibration that generated immediate, penetrating heat, cutting through the damp, freezing chill of her soot-stained clothes. The thick material smelled intensely of pine resin, cedar, and the clean ozone scent of his skin. It was the scent of absolute safety, washing over her like a physical tide and dismantling the last remnants of her survival instinct. "I have you," Gideon murmured, his voice dropping to a rough private register, meant only for her ears. He did not ask for an explanation of how she had escaped the archive, nor did he demand to know the details of her terrifying journey through the steam channels. He simply recognized the immense toll her body had paid to secure their future, and he moved to protect what remained of her strength. She leaned into his chest, her forehead resting against his collarbone. The excruciating pain in her lower back flared again as another wave of early labor tightened her abdomen, but the panic that had driven her through the ice and darkness was entirely gone. She gripped the lapels of the royal coat, her ink-stained, cracked fingers curling into the expensive fabric. Gideon slid one strong arm beneath her knees and the other across her back, lifting her carefully from the cold stone floor. He moved with extreme calculation, adjusting his grip to avoid placing any pressure on her swollen stomach. The transition from the unforgiving hardness of the ground to the secure, heated cradle of his arms made Evangeline release a long, shuddering breath. "The carriage is waiting," he whispered, his jaw resting briefly against her soot-streaked hair. "We are leaving this place." He carried her toward the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall, walking right through the center of the room. The imperial arbiters stepped back, bowing their heads in silent respect, not just for the king, but for the quiet, fierce woman who had just altered the political landscape of the north. Evangeline closed her eyes, letting the humming warmth of the cloak lull her into a detached peace. The fortress that had been her prison was already fading into irrelevance, reduced to nothing more than a seized asset on a royal ledger, while she was being carried toward the only sanctuary that truly mattered. The rhythmic shudder of the royal carriage, rolling over packed snow, anchored the space. The heavy iron-banded wheels bit into the winter road, eating the miles between the fallen fortress of Silt-Hold and the capital. Inside the cabin, the environment was a stark contrast to the freezing, hostile architecture Evangeline Sterling had just left behind. It smelled of polished cedarwood, warm leather, and the faint, ozone-like scent that always clung to her mate. Thick velvet curtains were drawn tight over the windows, sealing out the biting northern wind. She lay back against the deep cushions, her body wrapped completely in the heated silk cloak. The thermal threads woven into the dark fabric radiated a steady, comforting warmth that seeped into her trembling muscles, countering the violent chill she had endured in the courtyard. Her breath hitched, coming in short, sharp pulls as another contraction seized her abdomen. Her mind, perpetually trained to measure and calculate, involuntarily counted the seconds between the spikes of physical pressure. She listened to the rotation of the axles, using the speed of the carriage to estimate their geographical position. They were moving fast, perhaps too fast for the uneven terrain, but the heavy suspension of the sovereign transport absorbed the worst of the jarring impacts. Still, the swaying motion made it difficult for her to find purchase. The physical strain was a vast, heavy weight settling deep into her pelvis, demanding an absolute surrender of control. For a woman whose survival relied entirely on maintaining perfect, calculated order, the biological chaos of childbirth was a profound vulnerability. Gideon Alistair understood this without needing a single word of explanation. He did not hover nervously, nor did he offer the hollow, frantic reassurances common to frightened men. The Alpha King occupied the confined space of the carriage with the same measured deliberation he brought to the High Court. Shedding his ceremonial overcoat, he rolled up the sleeves of his dark linen shirt. He knelt on the wide floorboard between the bench seats, positioning himself directly in front of her. "The suspension will hold, but the road through the lower pass is uneven," the Sovereign stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated pleasantly in the enclosed space. He was giving her logistical facts, anchoring her racing mind to concrete realities rather than abstract fears. As another wave of blinding pressure crested, the cartographer's knuckles turned white where she gripped the edge of the velvet seat. Before she could slide with the carriage's motion, he moved. He placed his large, calloused hands firmly over her hips, pressing down with calculated weight. He used his mass to steady her against the rhythmic swaying, absorbing the lateral force into his shoulders so her body remained stable. The tactile grounding worked instantly. The disorienting sensation of being adrift in the motion ceased, replaced by the immovable certainty of his grip. "Breathe with the count," he instructed quietly, feeling the tension locking her spine. 3 seconds in. Hold for 1. 4 seconds out. I have you. You will not shift. She focused on the warmth radiating from his palms through the silk cloak. She forced her lungs to obey his rhythm, riding the contraction down into a manageable ache. The carriage struck a rut in the snow, jolting violently, but his arms functioned as a secondary suspension system. Her hips did not move a fraction of an inch. He held her anchored to the earth when her own body threatened to tear her apart, providing the exact structural support she required. The final stages of labor compressed time into a singular, intense focus. The political ruin of Earl Roderick and the freezing archives faded beneath the visceral reality of the carriage interior. Evangeline reached out blindly, her fingers searching for leverage. Gideon immediately offered his forearms, allowing her to dig her nails into his skin without a flinch. The habit of masking her anguish from indifferent onlookers had become second nature. The instinct for silent endurance remained ingrained. Instead, her breath hissed sharply through clenched teeth, her throat releasing only low, guttural sounds of extreme physical exertion. The pressure crested into an unbearable peak. The world narrowed to the scent of cedar, the heat of the silk, and the absolute steadiness of the man anchoring her. He maintained his position, his voice a constant drone of tactical encouragement. He merely provided the rhythmic pacing she needed, counting the seconds. His presence was not overbearing. It was a perfectly calibrated partnership, a protector offering his complete strength to support her labor without overriding her agency. With one final, breathless push that arched her spine off the cushions, the crushing pressure suddenly vanished, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. A heartbeat later, the sharp, demanding cry of a newborn filled the warm carriage. She collapsed back against the velvet bench, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with dark spots. The sound of her child crying was a magnificent noise, shattering the tense silence. She tried to lift her head, her muscles trembling violently. The Sovereign moved with swift, reverent efficiency. He received the squalling infant, with hands accustomed to wielding royal decrees, now impossibly gentle. He quickly checked the child's breathing. Needing something pristine to wrap the newborn, his eyes fell upon the scuffed, iron-rimmed, leather satchel resting on the floorboard. He did not hesitate. Bypassing the bronze scroll tube that had just dismantled a dukedom, he extracted a wide square of fine sterile linen. It was the cloth she meticulously used to polish her delicate brass magnifying lenses and mapping compasses, the cleanest, softest material available. He used her cartography cloth to gently clean their child, a silent, profound gesture that honored the very intellect and tools that had saved them both. He wrapped the infant securely in the sterile linen, then layered a section of his own thick wool overcoat around the small bundle for maximum warmth. "A son," he murmured, his voice finally losing a fraction of its iron control, softening into something thick with awe. He turned, shifting his weight carefully with the motion of the carriage, and placed the swaddled newborn onto her chest. She felt the tiny, solid weight settle against her heart. Her trembling hands came up to frame the child's head, her thumb brushing against the soft, damp skin. The infant's cries quieted immediately upon feeling her warmth, settling into a steady, rhythmic breathing that matched the rotation of the carriage wheels. He leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. He did not claim ownership over the moment. He simply occupied the space beside her, sharing the quiet, immense victory of their survival in the safest room in the world. The fire in the royal nursery burned steady, feeding on thick logs of cured cedar that filled the chamber with a rich, resinous warmth. Evangeline Sterling sat in a high-backed armchair upholstered in soft wool, a heavy woven blanket draped over her knees. Her body still carried the deep, bruised ache of the freezing courtyard and the carriage berth, a heavy lethargy settling into her bones, yet her mind felt remarkably clear. The persistent hypervigilance of the past 2 weeks was slowly thawing in the quiet safety of the capital. Beside her chair, a carved wooden bassinet held their sleeping son, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, unbothered cadence. She reached toward the low oak table beside her, where the battered iron-rimmed leather satchel rested. Its surface was scored by gravel and stained with the dirty snow of Silt-Hold, a permanent physical record of her escape. Opening the heavy brass buckles required a slow, deliberate effort from her stiff fingers, but the familiar scent of old parchment and metallic ink grounded her immediately. Evangeline did not pull out the treasonous charts. Those were already in the hands of the administrative courts. Instead, she retrieved her personal mapping instruments. She carefully organized her dry brass dividers, wiping the cold metal with a clean linen cloth. The sharp, precise points of the compass gleamed in the firelight. She aligned the measuring calipers parallel to the edge of the table, letting the mathematical order soothe the lingering chaos of the trial. Her survival had not depended on sudden magic or raw physical combat, but on the exact measurements and unyielding geometry represented by these tools. Arranging them within arm's reach of the bassinet, she established a new perimeter of safety. The gravel had bitten into her palms like broken teeth during her crawl across the high court, leaving shallow, red abrasions across her skin. Now, those same hands meticulously polished a silver straight edge, the sting of the wounds a physical reminder of the distance she had crossed. She traced the engraved ruler markings, counting the millimeters as a grounding exercise. 1, 2, 3. The numbers were absolute. They could not lie, forge a treaty, or manipulate a council. The quiet repetition of counting allowed the final tension in her shoulders to drop, her breathing finally matching the slow, steady rhythm of her newborn. The room remained absolutely silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the infant's soft exhalations. Evangeline checked the tension on the brass hinges of her dividers, ensuring the joints moved smoothly without catching. The physical routine of calibration, checking angles, securing clasps, wiping away imaginary dust, was a necessary anchor. For years she had conditioned herself to suppress her terror in hostile environments, masking her calculations behind a quiet, compliant demeanor. Now, in a space that belonged entirely to her, she did not have to hide her competence. She could simply exist a sovereign over her own workspace, with the undeniable proof of her endurance resting peacefully beside her. The heavy oak door opened with barely a whisper of iron hinges. Alpha King Gideon Alistair stepped into the nursery, bringing with him the faint scent of winter air and burning wax from the Imperial archives. He moved with the unhurried, measured grace that defined his authority, his boots making no sound against the thick woven rugs. He had shed his formal armor and his heated silk cloak, wearing only a simple dark tunic that emphasized the quiet exhaustion around his eyes. Yet his posture remained perfectly straight, the tension of the day's political warfare settling firmly onto his broad shoulders. In his right hand, he carried a thick roll of imperial vellum. Evangeline watched him cross the room, setting her brass dividers aside. Gideon did not speak immediately. He approached the bassinet first, pausing to look down at the sleeping infant. For a long moment, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories simply stood still, watching the fragile rise and fall of their son's breathing. He reached out, tracing a single calloused knuckle over the edge of the woven blanket, careful not to disturb the child's rest. Only then did he turn his attention to her. Gideon knelt beside her armchair, bringing himself to eye level rather than towering over her seated form. He placed the heavy vellum on the oak table, right beside her meticulously aligned cartography tools. The document was the finalized sovereign writ of attainder. Evangeline recognized the dark crimson of the royal seal. Pressed deep into the paper, flanked by the secondary stamps of Imperial Arbiter Ronald Vance. "It is recorded," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated pleasantly in the quiet room. "The lineage of Roderick Blackwood is legally dissolved. Silt-Hold and all its subsidiary territories have been formally annexed to the crown. His assets are seized, his trading routes dismantled, and his enforcers, including Cyrus Thorne, have been remanded to the wardens." There was no boastful pride in his tone, only the factual delivery of structural justice. He had not burned the enemy's kingdom with fire or blade, slaughtering innocent peasants for the sins of their lord. Instead, he had burned it down with ink, ledgers, and absolute sovereign law, ensuring the fallen earl could never raise a banner, sign a treaty, or claim a single coin of leverage again. It was a complete, clinical annihilation. Gideon picked up the heavy decree and gently laid it at the foot of the carved bassinet. It rested there, a physical, undeniable shield woven from imperial authority, guaranteeing that the child would inherit a territory scrubbed clean of treason. He then reached out, offering his hand, palm up, waiting for her permission. Evangeline placed her bandaged, abrasive palm against his. His fingers curled around hers, warm and impossibly gentle, grounding her entirely. The long, freezing winter of isolation was over. Their future was now mapped, measured, and permanently sealed.